Forbidden Pages. There's an old, forgotten town buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place known to locals as Hollowbrook. It's a place where the air is thick with secrets, and the earth itself seems to keep its own dark memories. Hollowbrook isn't on most maps. Its name barely whispers through the corridors of history. But those who live there, or rather, those who have lived there, will tell you one thing. No one who ever finds the Book of Shadows ever leaves the town the same. The story starts with a young woman named Emily Turner, a writer in her late 20s with a keen sense of curiosity and a head full of ambition. Emily had recently moved to Hollowbrook to finish her first novel, a horror fiction that she believed would finally make her a name in the literary world. The quiet, isolated town was the perfect place to find inspiration, or so she thought. Emily had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town. It was rustic, charming, with its squeaky wooden floors and creaking windows, but there was something about the place that made her uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that the land beneath her cabin had witnessed countless stories no one ever dared tell. The locals, for their part, weren't welcoming. They were polite, but their eyes always lingered on her longer than was comfortable. They'd give her advice on where to eat or what trails to walk, but they would never mention the town's past. And as far as she could tell, they never discussed anything that had happened in the hills behind the cabin. One evening, as Emily wandered through the local antique store in Hollowbrook's tiny town center, something caught her eye, a dusty old book tucked away on the top shelf behind a glass display case. The cover was worn, its edges frayed with age, the letters on its spine so faded that they were unreadable. But there was something about the way the book stood out, even in the dim light of the shop, that pulled her in. The shopkeeper, an old man with spectacles perched on the tip of his nose, noticed her gaze. He shuffled over, his feet barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floor. "Ah, you found it," he said in a gravelly voice. Emily blinked, slightly startled. "Found what?" "That book," the shopkeeper said, his eyes darting to the glass case as though he feared it might leap off the shelf at any moment. "That's no ordinary book." Emily raised an eyebrow. She had seen plenty of old books in her life, but something about his tone made her heart skip. "What do you mean?" The man glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "It's the Book of Shadows. They say it was written by a man who tried to dabble with things beyond human understanding. Some say it's cursed. Others say it's dangerous. But no one really knows. They say whoever reads it will be marked, will be haunted by something not quite alive." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something that never leaves you." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. It sounded like the sort of story she'd read in a ghost tale or a supernatural thriller, but here in this dingy little store, it felt real. "Is that a warning?" she asked, her curiosity overpowering any hesitation. "Maybe," the shopkeeper muttered, eyes shifting nervously. "But if you want it, you can have it. Just know what you're asking for." The price was shockingly low, almost too good to be true, but Emily didn't hesitate. She paid him, took the book, and left the shop with a strange sense of excitement. She hadn't believed in curses or anything supernatural, at least not until now. But something about the book felt significant. It called to her, whispered promises of discovery, as if it was waiting for someone like her to open it. That night, in the solitude of her cabin, Emily sat down with the Book of Shadows spread out before her. The pages were thick and yellowed with age, and the ink, though faded, still seemed oddly vibrant under the candlelight. She ran her fingers along the edges of the pages, her mind racing with questions. What kind of secrets would be locked inside? What horrors lay waiting to be uncovered? With a deep breath, she began to read. The first pages were filled with strange symbols, cryptic writings that seemed to pulse in the dim light. She couldn't understand them, not at first, but as she turned the pages, something changed. The words began to make sense, the symbols unraveling like an ancient language she was suddenly fluent in. It was as if the book was feeding her knowledge, filling her mind with its dark whispers. She couldn't stop reading, even though the air around her grew colder, the shadows in the room seeming to stretch and twist. By the time she reached the end of the book, the candles had long since burned out, and the silence in the cabin was suffocating. Emily's heart raced in her chest as she looked down at the last page, the ink now dark and fresh as if it had been written just moments before. The final words were simple, chilling. "Now you are mine." Her skin prickled. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it. The room around her felt wrong, as though it was bending in on itself. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, and a faint, unsettling whisper filled her ears, low, unintelligible, but unmistakably there. She looked around, but there was no one. No one but the whispers. Suddenly she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? No one ever visited her at this hour. Slowly, cautiously, she stood up and made her way to the door, her pulse thumping in her ears. She opened it, and to her surprise there was no one there. Just the howling wind and the swirling mist that had settled over Hollowbrook that evening. But then as she stepped outside she saw someone, standing at the edge of the woods. A figure, cloaked in black, stood motionless, facing her. Its face was hidden beneath the shadow of its hood, but Emily could feel its eyes on her, burning into her. Her breath caught in her throat, and a cold sweat broke out on her skin. It was the book, she realized with horror. It wasn't just a story. It was real. The curse, whatever it was now hers. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, Emily saw its face, a twisted, gaunt visage, eyes hollow and empty. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door behind her. But it was no use. She could feel it now, the presence, the weight of something in the house with her. The book had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and now something was coming for her. She backed away from the door, heart pounding. The whispers had started again, louder this time. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around her. Emily realized the truth too late. The Book of Shadows wasn't just cursed. It was alive, and it would take everything from her. The price of knowledge. The darkness in Emily's cabin seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The whispers had grown louder, now mingling with the eerie creaking of the wooden walls. It was as if the house itself had become part of the curse, its very foundations shaking under the weight of something ancient and malevolent.
She could still hear the figure outside, the one in the cloak, standing motionless at the edge of the woods. Was it waiting for her to step outside again? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had to act fast. There was no time to waste. Her fingers shook as she fumbled for her phone, but the screen remained dark. No signal. Of course. Hollowbrook was isolated, far from any kind of help. It was just her, alone with whatever horrors the book had unleashed. She ran her fingers through her hair, pacing frantically. The book, the cursed Book of Shadows, was the key, she realized. But what had it unlocked? What was the price of the knowledge it had given her? There had to be something she could do, some way to stop this. Her gaze landed on the book, still open on the table, its pages now stained with something dark, blood, perhaps, or ink from the otherworldly symbols that had filled its pages. She reached out to close it, but as her hand touched the cover, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The book was alive in a way that went beyond mere words on a page. It was pulling her in, drawing her deeper into its curse. Without thinking, she snatched the book up, her breath shallow, heart pounding. The whispers seemed to crescendo as the words seemed to blur in front of her eyes, as though they were shifting, rearranging, trying to form something new. And then she saw it, something written in a language she didn't recognize. Symbols she had never seen before, but they felt familiar. They felt as if they were part of her now. The moment she read them, her world seemed to collapse. The walls of the cabin stretched and twisted, as if they were being distorted by an unseen force. The room swirled with darkness, the shadows thickening, becoming solid. Something shifted in the air, something malevolent. The temperature plummeted, and her breath became visible in the freezing cold. She could feel the presence now, close, breathing down her neck. Something was in the room with her. She turned quickly, her heart racing, but the space behind her was empty. Yet the air was thick with a presence, an oppressive weight that she couldn't escape. The figure from outside had crossed the threshold, entered her home, without her even realizing it. She could feel its eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, staring into her very soul. It was here. "Who are you?" she gasped, her voice trembling. She had to know. She had to understand. The figure didn't move, but its shadow stretched across the room, inching closer. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls, it spoke. "You read the book. You asked for knowledge?" Emily's body went rigid, her legs unable to carry her as she stumbled backward. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her breath coming in gasps. "You're cursed now, Emily Turner," the figure whispered, its tone almost sorrowful. The curse of the Book of Shadows isn't one that can be lifted by regret. You cannot unsee what you've seen. You cannot undo the things you have learned. You are mine now. She wanted to scream, to run, but the words froze her in place. Her mind raced. What did this thing want? Why had it come for her? The figure took another step forward, and she instinctively pressed her back to the wall, unable to tear her eyes away from the grotesque form before her. "Why me?" she managed to croak. "What do you want?" The figure's shadowed form tilted its head, as if considering the question. "You opened the door. You brought yourself here. I am the one who guards the knowledge. Those who dare to seek it pay the price. And you, Emily, will pay more than you know." Her breath hitched. "I'll stop. I'll never read it again. Just leave me alone." But the figure was unmoved, its hollow gaze burning through her. "You don't understand. It's too late. You've already made your choice. The book has taken you. And once it takes you, it doesn't let go." A sudden, deafening bang shook the walls, rattling the windows in their frames. Emily's heart nearly stopped in her chest. The lights flickered violently before plunging the cabin into pitch blackness. The whispers, once faint, now consumed her. It felt like they were inside her head, filling every corner of her mind, twisting her thoughts. It was happening. The shadows, thick as tar, began to creep along the floor, writhing like living things. The book in her hands throbbed with an unnatural energy, as though it was calling to her, beckoning her to open it again. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, fighting against the compulsion. The voices in her head grew louder, more desperate, urging her to read the book, to unlock the truth, to know everything. With every passing moment, the cabin seemed to close in on her, as though the house itself was alive, suffocating her in its grip. She could hear the whispers of the lost souls who had come before her, the ones who had read the cursed words and vanished without a trace. She could hear their pain, their regret, their desperate pleas for release. "Please," she whispered, clutching the book to her chest. "Please, tell me how to stop it." The figure's hollow voice echoed around her. "There is no stopping it. There is only the price to pay." Before she could process what was happening, the shadows surged forward, and the book slipped from her hands, opening with a sickening thud as the pages turned of their own accord. The room seemed to bend, distorting around her as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as if the weight of everything, of the curse, of the knowledge, had finally consumed her. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The whispers faded. The shadows retreated. The figure, once so menacing, was gone. Emily stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The cabin was quiet once more. But it wasn't the same. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. The book, still open on the floor, seemed to pulse with the dark energy. Something had changed. She wasn't sure what it was, but she felt it in her bones. She was marked now. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would never be free. The book had claimed her, and she had opened a door that could never be closed. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, Emily understood the terrible truth. The Book of Shadows had not just cursed her. It had made her part of its story. And it would never let her go. The unseen hand. Emily stood motionless, staring at the book. The room was silent now, except for the faint whisper of the wind outside, and yet the heavy presence still lingered in the air, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Her hands were trembling as she picked up the book again, the pages still turned open to the dark, unreadable language that had taken hold of her mind. She knew, deep down, that her life would never be the same again. The figure had disappeared, vanished without a trace, but she could still feel its presence, haunting her every step. It wasn't gone, not really. It was inside her mind, inside her very soul, lurking in the corners of her thoughts. "You are mine now." The words echoed in her mind like a broken record, growing louder with every passing second. She had tried to close the book, to push away the darkness that had flooded her life, but it wouldn't let her. There was no escaping it. The curse of the Book of Shadows wasn't something that could be shrugged off. It was a part of her now, bound to her in a way that went beyond any earthly explanation. She could feel it in the air, in the silence that filled her cabin, in the suffocating darkness that pressed in from every side. But even as the dread crept over her, Emily realized something. She wasn't alone in this. The whispers, the figure, the things that had haunted her, they had all been part of something much bigger than her. Something ancient. Something that lived inside the book, inside the town of Hollowbrook, inside the very fabric of the world itself. And Emily, whether she liked it or not, was now a part of it. Her mind raced as she looked around the room, her eyes landing on the small window that offered a glimpse of the world beyond. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. But even the sunlight couldn't chase away the darkness that had settled into her bones. She felt a sharp pull, an undeniable urge to leave, to step outside and see if the world beyond had changed. Something inside her told her that whatever had happened to her in the cabin, whatever had been awakened by the book, was not over. It was just beginning. The figure, the whispers, the cursed book, it was all tied together. And Emily knew now that she had no choice but to confront it. She had read the book, yes, but that didn't mean she had truly understood its power. She had only scratched the surface of what it meant, what it wanted. With a sense of resolve, she gathered the book in her hands and walked toward the door, her legs unsteady beneath her. She stepped outside, feeling the cold morning air bite at her skin. The mist that had surrounded Hollowbrook was thicker than it had been the night before, swirling around her ankles like ghostly fingers reaching up from the earth. She could feel the pull of the town, the pull of the curse, drawing her forward. As she walked through the mist, the trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was trying to hold her in place. The whispers were louder now, echoing in her ears, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to flinch. Not now. The town was silent, eerily so. There were no birds, no animals, not even the usual rustling of the wind. Hollowbrook felt empty, as though it had been abandoned, as though the very essence of life had been drained from it. Emily continued walking, her eyes scanning the streets, looking for any sign of life. But there was nothing. And then, at the far end of the street, she saw it. The figure stood there, as it had before, motionless, cloaked in black, its hollow eyes staring into hers. It was waiting for her, just as it had always been. The figure stepped forward, slowly, its movements unnaturally smooth, as though it wasn't fully part of this world. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered. "The book has chosen you. And you will stay. Forever." Emily's heart raced in her chest. She wanted to run, to turn and flee, but her legs refused to move. It was as though an unseen force had locked her in place. The figure reached out with a long, skeletal hand, its fingers cold and skeletal. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I refuse to be bound to this place." The figure tilted its head, as if amused by her defiance. "You already are," it said softly. "The curse is within you, and it will never let you go." In that moment, something shifted. Emily could feel the curse, the weight of the book, the darkness that had entered her life, trying to take control. But she wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. The wind howled, and the mist thickened, swirling around them like a storm. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and for a split second, she saw flashes, images of people from Hollowbrook, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. They had all been here before, all of them victims of the same fate. They had been chosen. And now, so had she. But Emily refused to let it end like that. She had the power. The knowledge from the book. She could break free. She had to. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the knife she had kept with her for protection. She didn't know why she had brought it, but in that moment, it felt like the only choice. She raised the knife high, her grip firm, her heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It stood there, watching her, as if it were waiting for her to make the first move. And then, with all her strength, Emily plunged the knife into the book, driving it deep into the pages. The moment the blade made contact, the world seemed to shudder. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the sky above seemed to crack open with a deafening roar. The figure screeched, a terrible, otherworldly sound, as the book began to burn. The flames that erupted from the pages were not of this world. They were black, flickering with an unnatural light, devouring the book with a ravenous hunger. Emily felt the heat of the fire, but it didn't burn her. Instead, it seemed to purify, to cleanse the curse from her body. The figure let out one final scream as it disappeared into the smoke, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The whispers fell silent. The shadows receded. And for the first time since she had opened the book, Emily felt free. The mist around Hollowbrook began to dissipate, and the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the town in golden light. Emily stood in the middle of the street, her chest rising and falling with every breath, her eyes wide as she took in the world around her. It was over. The curse had been broken. But as she looked down at the ashes of the book, she realized something. The battle had been won, but the scars remained. The curse had been lifted, but the knowledge she had gained, the horrors she had witnessed, would stay with her forever. And though she was free, she couldn't help but wonder, what if the book hadn't been destroyed? What if it was still out there, waiting for someone else to open it? As Emily turned to leave Hollowbrook, she felt a chill run down her spine. The curse was broken, but the book was still out there, waiting. And one day, it would call to someone else,